University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and she graduated with a bachelor's degree in political science and a minor in sociology. Her parents were both born in Homs, Syria, and she spent most of her summers over there while growing up in Chicago. She spent every summer with friends and family in her parents' birthplace, Homs, Syria, and from there stems her attachment to her homeland. When the revolution started in March 2011, she took part in public awareness and in campaigns in her community and on her campus, just like we're doing today. However, after graduating, she was able to move to Washington, D.C. and became the Government Relations and Advocacy Assistant of the Syrian American Council. The Syrian American Council is, if you guys haven't heard about it, it's a grassroots organization devoted to promoting educational, civil, economic, and human development, as well as advancing civil liberties and human dignity in Syria. Yisser has traveled across the U.S. and spoken at events like this, but she's also been on news stations such as the BBC World Service, WBEZ World View, Russia Today, and more. So without further ado, please welcome her today as she will be discussing her recent trip to Syria, the depths of the current humanitarian crisis, and the shifts that need to occur to more directly help the Syrian people. Everyone, welcome to Syria.
Thank you for the introduction, Zaina, and I wanted to thank SOS Freedom for having me here. I really stalk what you guys do on campus, and you guys are amazing and you're an inspiration to a lot of other campus efforts that are starting throughout the country in order to support Syria in any way possible. So you guys are a great group of students, and I'd love to see more coming from you guys in the near future. I just want to thank you guys for having me here, and thank you for coming out and listening to what I have to say and my experience in Syria. But I'm going to start out, first of all, with a 9-minute mini documentary kind of overviewing our trip, and then we'll go from there. All right, just to kind of ask you guys, how many of you know the details of what's going on in Syria? All right, so you guys are pretty aware. Just to kind of summarize the state that Syria is in right now, most recent number coming out of Syria is that 70,000 people have been killed. And of course, I want to stress that these are 70,000 documented names. The names, the place, or where they're from, and the age of these people that have been killed are documented. On a daily basis, we're finding mass graves being discovered all throughout Syria. Tens of thousands are missing. And of course, when you're detained in Syria, they say that detention in Assad's dungeons are worse than death. And 4 million, according to USAID, 4 million are in urgent need of humanitarian aid inside Syria. At least 2.5 million Syrians are internally displaced. So these are Syrians that their houses got destroyed, or their cities are caught in a crossfire and they have nowhere to go, so they kind of locate to wherever is safer at the moment. And then there are 700,000 refugees in neighboring countries, including Iraq, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, and some in Egypt as well. And of course, we know that the revolution in Syria started out peacefully in March 2011, calling for democracy, for a national, or a civilian-led democracy. And this continued on for months. The activists had made sure that they did not want an armed revolution. They made clear that they did not want any sort of intervention. They wanted to do this on their own. Sunni, of course, was their slogan. But this protest movement was met by brute force. Of course, the Assad regime resorted to tanks, snipers, and shelling early on, and has continued, and has only gotten worse since then. So what we saw, just again, summary for you guys, is we saw that soldiers from the Assad regime had defected, and many of them decided to leave Syria in fear of their lives, because once you defect, your entire family is a target, because collective punishment is huge in Syria. But the Syrian people called upon them to return back home, and so they then became the protection arm for the peaceful movement. Over time, we saw more defections take place, and we saw civilians joining the Free Syrian Army. And then now we're at a situation where now we're in a military situation where the Free Syrian Army is making gains on the ground, so you see more offensive movements, not just defensive. So I will go more into depth about the involvement of the FSA. But just kind of some background. You saw the video, you kind of saw what we did. And I just want to clarify kind of why we went on this trip. You know, I'm a 23-year-old. I just graduated from university just like you guys. And I'm just active in the Syrian revolution as far as much as you can be when you're thousands of miles away. And there are many people like me, many of you are in the audience are just like me. And we're very attached to our homeland. And we felt that after 2 years, or after almost 2 years of what's going on in Syria, people are exhausted. I know the Syrian American community is exhausted. The diaspora has, continuously tried to support the revolution in any way possible, but people are getting very tired and they're seeing no end in sight. And that's something that's very draining, and you kind of lose hope. But the reality is you can't lose hope because the Syrian people aren't losing hope. So you have to keep on moving. So we were looking for a kind of a way to reinvigorate and re-energize the activists. And of course, kind of going and seeing how our work here can better support the people on the ground. If these public awareness campaigns are important, if these mini fundraising campaigns are important, or how they can be improved to make sure that they're important. And finally, we went with a very specific perspective, which is the Syrian American voice. We're first and foremost, we were born here, we were raised here, so we're American, but we have a very strong tie to our homeland. And it's a different voice than an American journalist going in or a Western journalist going in and kind of reporting on what they saw. And it's a different voice from a Syrian that's living there and that is seeing these things on a daily basis. So we have that clear voice, and we're hoping that we can kind of project that to the media here. So that's kind of the background as to why we went to a war-torn country. A lot of people kind of questioned it, but it was definitely an eye-opening experience. And again, I thank you guys for being here to listen. So you can go ahead and start. The pictures are, I'll just tell you what to change. You can go ahead. So like the video mentioned, we visited 3 camps. And these camps, they're not refugee camps. They're actually camps for the internally displaced. So like I said, there are Syrians inside Syria whose houses have been destroyed. These are millions of people at this point. So imagine the chaos. People are leaving shelling and they're running away from airstrikes and they have nowhere to go. So what we saw happen was, for the refugees that were able to leave, they went to Turkey. But now at the Turkish and Syrian border, there is a 6-month backlog kind of refugees that are able to go into Turkey, because the Turkish camps, they're not enough to the amount of people that are fleeing. So you can go ahead. So what we did was we visited these 3 camps that are inside Syria, but only about a mile in. And they're near the Turkish border, so the Turkish government has Patriot missiles lined up. Unfortunately, these camps have been attacked by the Assad regime. So the 3 camps that we visited, like the video mentioned, were Altmi, Qah, and Karami. And how this camp started were families fleeing their villages came and they found olive groves. They found olive groves, of course, because that area, that's kind of where they get their livelihood from. They grow olives and they make olive oil. This is their livelihood. So it's known as the olive tree camp. So families had to camp under these camps, camp under these olive trees until someone realized that they were there. And then they started getting kind of very light support, kind of for tents and things like that, until we saw it got a little bit more media attention. And now it is kind of ballooned, where in the ultimate refugee camp, it goes between 13,000 to 15,000 refugees that are staying in these camps. In the Qah refugee camp, you have about 3,500 refugees. And then in the Karami refugee camp, the freshest refugee camp, again, it's internally displaced camp, and there's about 1,500 refugees. And to kind of talk about these camps is difficult because, you think you understand what a humanitarian crisis looks like, and you think you understand what it means to not have heating and not have water and not have these basic necessities that are needed to survive. But, going to these camps and you realize not only do these refugees not have them, but some had to pay for their own tents. These are people that have fled their homes. They have nothing. At one point, they had houses just like us. They lived comfortably just like us. But they had to flee shelling, and they had to flee the airstrikes. And they had to go and live under these tents. Oftentimes, their life savings at this point are spent because they have been out of work for almost 2 years. So whatever they have left is what they're investing into these camps. And at the same time, refugees are found buying food from local villages. So when I say that these camps are not receiving aid, it's to the point where people are forced to buy their tents and forced to buy their food. That was very eye-opening to see. Very disheartening, of course. But, I mean, these camps are receiving some level of aid, but the key is, of course, it is never enough. The amount of aid, obviously, going into Syria is never enough, and the amount of aid in these camps are kind of like a microcosm of what's going on in Syria. So there's not enough aid, there's lack of consistent aid. So 1 month, the camps will have enough to get by, or barely enough to get by, and then the next month they'll have nothing. And so then you have the cycle where the people in the camps are looking to the management of the camps and saying, where is our food this month? And then they think that the management stole the food, when in reality there was no food. So this also creates a cycle of distrust, and people aren't trusting each other when it's just the fact that there is no support getting to these camps. So that's what we saw in these refugee camps. To kind of go into kind of detail about these camps again, about not only do they lack everything, but they have to pay for these tents. They have to pay for tents that are flammable, for example. So because there's no heat, they have to heat themselves with candles. So what happened while we were there twice, I was there for only 10 days, 12 days. Twice there were fires in tents. And kind of one example is that there was a family from the suburbs of Hama, and they had survived a mortar shell landing right in their kitchen. They have I think it was 4 children. So they had survived the regime attacking their home and destroying their home. They survived that. And the children survived that. And then they went to the camp, and the children were burnt to death because the camp lit on fire. And what's frustrating is that these are things that can be solved if there was the aid that was going to the right places through the right channels, and I can obviously go into that. And then of course, so there was the idea of tents that happened twice. Children were burnt alive while they were there. Another example is that there's an extension of the ultimate refugee camp, where this is a picture of an activist that an activist took. This is kind of what they get for one day if you don't pay for your own food. One boiled potato per tent. Now that tent can have 11 people, or that tent can have 4 people, but you have to divide that one potato between all of the people in your family. And I wish I was exaggerating, and I wish I was making this sound a lot more dramatic, but this was the reality of what's going on in these camps. And then, being in these camps, you not only do you realize that they don't have the aid, the consistent aid that they need. Obviously, the lack of sanitation is horrific. There's about, I believe it was like 50 toilets for about 10,000 people, and these are toilets kind of just built, and then you kind of stick whatever toilet you find, or holes in the ground or whatever, built for 10,000 people. And now recently we've been hearing about diseases due to sanitation issues in these refugee camps. So just imagine all these things that are going on in the camp. And then their medical conditions are there. I met a young girl who was about 12 years old, whose face had become blue. It looked like she was bruised because she has a heart condition and she has nowhere to go. And we're visiting these camps, right? And we're talking to these people, and we're trying to document what's going on and how we can support them. And what we realized was that people were very frustrated with us being there. They were very frustrated. I'm Syrian, right? So I'm thinking that they would be okay with us being there, and they would welcome it, and they would want to tell their story. Little did I know, they had seen tens of people come through their camp, tens of people ask for their stories. Young man chanting at me, "Oh, you're only good to take pictures, you're only good to take pictures." And of course, that was humbling, and that's the reality, is that we are only good to take pictures, but whatever we do is not enough. So we can go ahead. So this is the Qah refugee camp. It's a little bit better situation than Altni. As you can see, the kind of green leaves on the side. Like I said, the olive groves that these people are kind of living around and under were the livelihoods at one point, kind of where they made their money, and now they have to cut down their livelihoods basically to heat themselves. They have no fuel, because in Syria you have to use diesel and you have to use fuel to heat homes and apartments and things like that. It's for cooking and things like that. So now they have to cut, just think about the symbolic power. Of course, they're cutting down what used to be their livelihoods to be able to heat themselves. And so you see these children here kind of taking part in that. Go ahead. And here's the Qah refugee camp again. This kind of picture just kind of speaks to, we kind of get caught up with this overwhelming humanitarian crisis, and we forget kind of the human story. But being among everybody you realize that every single person in that store, every single person in that camp had a narrative. Every single person had a story to tell. And it was just one example that I have was when I was kind of just with the children, and these camps are filled with children. They're the most beautiful and happy children. That's the beauty of being a child, I guess, is that you move on and you kind of live in the situation. And there was a young girl who was singing a protest song, of course, because the revolution has enveloped them. And she's singing a protest song, and she's happy. And then right before we were leaving, and we were saying bye to these kids that we had grown attached to, she's like, "Oh, by the way, my dad's a martyr, and her uncle was detained." And it was as if it was nothing at that point. She didn't cry. She wasn't upset. This is the reality that they live in. You hear countless stories. You hear people whose houses got destroyed, whose wives have been raped, and it's completely different to hear these stories first person. And it's not a movie, it's real life at this point. And here's the Karama refugee camp. To get an example of how there was no aid getting to this camp was supported by one man from Libya. He had a connection to someone from the suburbs of Hama, and they talked, and he's like, the suburbs of Hama are under attack now. They're going to be a big rush of refugees. We need to prepare ourselves. And so he supported this camp. The tents since then have improved a little bit, but there are about 175 breastfeeding babies in that camp that receive, of course, baby formula is lacking and diapers, like the documentary said. This is just an example. This is the doctor's office, I guess, that is at the Karami refugee camp. And this was the camp that the family came and saw how bad it was, and they decided that they would rather die under shelling than live in these and die in these situations. Again, the mud, of course, throughout the time. But after we left, it had started snowing, so imagine the conditions in the snow. And trash is everywhere. Imagine the disease. I'm sure you guys know, or you're aware of the diseases. And this was not just, of course, in the camps, but we saw this in liberated Syria as well, because government services are cut off to any opposition-controlled areas. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about liberated Syria. Liberated Syria was a lot kind of more happy, I guess, than the refugee camps. The refugee camps were very overwhelming, and you kind of don't know where to start. But liberated Syria, despite the humanitarian crisis, of course, despite how difficult it is, it was a lot more kind of optimistic. And so what we did while we were there, of course, I don't know if you guys are aware, but northern Syria is considered liberated, and then there are neighborhoods within the rest of Syria that are under opposition control, but of course contested back and forth between the regime and the Free Syrian Army. But northern Syria is controlled by the Free Syrian Army, except for the sky, which is what we're seeing. The regime has escalated attacks in using MiGs and Suhois, and more recently we're seeing Scud missiles. The other day, my friend actually is in Syria right now, he said it's raining Scuds. That's kind of what's going on now in northern Syria. But so what we did was we visited 2 villages in the suburbs of Aleppo. And one city that we visited was a city that had been liberated for about a year now. And what was nice about the city, or what was different about the city, is that there was never a Syrian regime kind of army presence in there, because it was located between mountains, so the strategic location was good. The people in the village had defected, and so they were doing well. But it also kind of functioned as a military base for the various battalions that we saw kind of roaming all around Syria, and I can speak to that, of course. So when we visited the village, we kind of got in late. We had to sneak in from Turkey, go into Syria, because we don't have Syrian passports, or they're expired. And of course, these village crossings are controlled by the Free Syrian Army, but we were able to get through once we got to the Syrian side. And we got there a little bit late, and there was no electricity throughout the entire village. And what we understood was that there hasn't been electricity for months in that village, except for whoever was able to have a kind of a generator. So we went to the hospital in that village, and the hospital is known to be one of the best hospitals in all of the suburbs of Aleppo. And it was actually supported, these are amazing kind of stories, it was supported by Egyptians. Egyptian doctors that had left Egypt came into Syria to be doctors for that hospital, and also monetarily support it. So one of the best well-known hospitals in the suburbs of Aleppo that treated both Assad soldiers and FSA soldiers. That was obviously very good to see. And there's this idea of remaining just, and that So visited the hospitals, and again there was that feeling of the doctors asking us, why are you here? What do you want from us? So what, you're Syrian American? I mean, there's this distrust that they have, and it's not obviously towards me, but it's towards the international community. And again, it was very tough to deal with that because I'm Syrian and I'm supposed to be there, thinking selfishly I'm here to help. But they said it took them a long time to trust us, it really did. And eventually they did, and then they took us upstairs and we talked to them. And what's crazy is that they are living their normal lives, but in my head the entire time, I'm like, wait, this is one of the best hospitals. What if the regime wanted to target it? What if the regime wanted to target it? But they just continue on and they live their lives normally. And then afterwards we went to one of the houses. And of course, if you know Syrians, they are very generous people. They are very hospitable people. This city hadn't had bread for weeks at times. They hadn't had flour to make bread for weeks at times, but they brought us meat to eat. And that was kind of very, also, you feel, I don't know how you feel at that point, but they brought us meat to eat, and they talked to us for hours after they had realized that we were here, to support them and to find out how we can support them. So what we did was we met with various members of what is known as civilian administrative councils. We mentioned that in the video. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but what's happening is throughout liberated regions in Syria, and then also in cities that are kind of still contested, there's a civilian initiative to come together, kind of. In some places they vote for people, and in some places they kind of just support people to positions where they run these councils that are trying to take the place of government services in their local villages to try to meet the needs of the people in their city. So they have, in some cases, they have 7 branches, where there's a branch to deal with the education situation. There's a branch to deal with the humanitarian situation, and there's a branch to deal with the security situation. So this was we're seeing this happen all throughout Syria. So the civilian initiative to kind of transition into a post-Assad Syria is there. But what was very eye-opening was that, of course, again, it goes back to the lack of support. And this kind of, again, speaks to the entire situation, to the entire kind of dynamic of Syria, is that the right people are not being supported. And so when we met with these civilian councils and we met with these representatives, at one point these were all FSA soldiers. They all had fought at one point, and then now they're coming back to their homes trying to go back to normal life. And the security had, prior to the revolution, had defected, so he was now the security head in the Civilian Administrative Council. But they don't have salaries for police officers, non-FSA soldiers. Again, like I said, there's an initiative to get away from the armed movement and to focus on the civilian movement. And so you'd have these discussions, and they say, and we would question them kind of back and forth, and we say, how are you getting your food? And unfortunately, what we saw, what was a kind of a theme in Syria, and I'll kind of touch back on it later, is that, of course, we know that the FSA is a wide spectrum. There's the secular, and then there's, of course, the extremists that are, before in Syria were not welcome, and now they're gaining presence. But what's frustrating is that these extremist groups are the ones that are meeting the needs of the people. So they're able to bypass these civilian administrative councils. So they're not trying to legitimize them. I mean, they obviously have an agenda, but by them being the resource and the source of food and funding, the civilian initiative is automatically decreased and automatically delegitimized. So this was something that we took note of course, was that because of the lack of support to the right people, to the right initiatives, the people that we don't want to support kind of meeting the needs of the people are the ones that are making these moves. And it's empowering the military arm versus the civilian arm. And you ask people, what's your opinion of these extremists? And I had secular FSA soldiers tell me, whoever can put bread in my child's mouth, I will support. So what you're seeing is that these groups are winning the hearts and minds of the people, rather than these councils meeting the needs of the people. So this was something that we saw in liberated Syria. Again, these extremist groups, they are still a minority, and they're kind of running into situations where they are delegitimizing themselves in the eyes of the Syrian people. But again, if we don't empower the civilians and the civilian initiatives, it'll be an issue post-Assad. And then so we visited that village, And then we went to a village called Idleb, and it was 2 hours away from where we were located, but through a different border crossing in Syria, from Turkey to Syria. And it was about 20 minutes into Syria. It was not that far of a drive at all. On our way in, about 40 kilometers to our right, I don't know what direction it was, there was a battle for an airport going on, like the landing of a Scud missile that had missed a village. Oh, you couldn't, by the way, flip the pictures, I'm sorry. This is liberated Syria. This is the first village that we visited. That's the president of the Civilian Administrative Council. And these are different representatives, doctors, architects that kind of have come together to support the village. Oh, this is kind of cool. The village that we were in, the first village that we were in, they brought down 2 MiGs, and then they kept that wing there to remind the city, or remind Bashar al-Assad, the quote is what they said, of what they did. So that's the remainder. And like I said about this city, they were liberated, and because of their strategic location, they did not receive as much bombing, but what they did receive was one big, I don't even know the name of it, but a bomb that landed in one, like a center. And it's not just something that you land and then it landing destroys the house. What it does is sucks all of the oxygen from the surrounding area. So all this destruction that you're seeing is not from a bomb landing on it, but it's from the oxygen being sucked out of that area. So this is 2 buildings that were 4 stories high, completely demolished. Again, with the olive trees having to cut down. She's 5 or 6 years old, and she has to support her family with heating. Okay, so this is our trip in. We had to go through a city called Assad. If you guys are I don't know if you guys know about it, but it's in, again, northern Syria, and has met a lot of force from the Assad regime. You can see this is kind of an iconic picture. It's not a good angle, but a mosque completely destroyed. And then you can keep going. And homes, this is all Assad, this is all our way in. We were supposed to stay there that night, but we had gotten note that we shouldn't because it was kind of dangerous and it was still being targeted. Again, with the garbage, but I think, yeah, okay, so here we are. So we're in Idleb at this point, and we're waiting for the Civilian Administrative Council president to come in and meet with us. At this point, we're just hanging out with local FSA soldiers, you know, very secular, but this was the time that I heard whoever gives me bread, I will support them. And I had dozed off for a few minutes, or no, probably a minute actually at that point, and because I hadn't slept the night before. And I wake up to an activist saying, listen, that's the sound of a MiG. And I look at him, I'm just like, no, don't make that joke, that's not funny. Within 3 seconds, we hear a boom, and then the glass shatters where we were sitting. And we found out after, you know, and of course when you first experience this, you know, it's not funny exactly, but you're in shock kind of, and you don't know what to do, and you don't know how to react. And because these are the things that we see on YouTube videos all the time, and you don't think that you're going to be a part of it ever. And we thought we were safe when we were in liberated Syria. And we find out that a TNT barrel was dropped about 500 meters, so about a third of a mile from where we were sitting. And these TNT barrels are big barrels of TNT, but the regime packs them with shrapnels and nails, anything metal basically. If they're not going to kill you with the TNT barrel, they will try to figure out a way to make sure that you can't walk anymore, and you can't, you know, you're paralyzed or you're losing a leg. And we found out that 18 people had been killed, 2 entire families had been wiped out. One of them was a Palestinian family. The majority of them were children. And so at that point, you know, we're in shock, and then you feel a sadness, and then you feel an anger, kind of. I think this is my experience. I was angry at that point because, first of all, people had died, of course, and you can't do anything about it. But what was very frustrating was that we were very close to death at that point, and it happened so quickly that you don't even know if you're going to make it. You don't realize that the TNT barrel is coming to be dropped on you. It's not something that's aimed, it's literally rolled out of a plane and hits you. And we realized, you know, if it was us that had been hit, we're Syrian Americans. You know, at the end of the day, we are Americans, and we came into Syria, and we have a story. If we had been killed, the world would have caught on for about a week, maybe 2 weeks. Kind of figured out who we were, where we were from, what our stories were, why we went to Syria. But because it wasn't us, and because it was 18 Syrian civilians that were attacked. No one's going to really know their story except for the neighbor that doesn't have a neighbor anymore and the child that doesn't have his friend to play with anymore. So that was very eye-opening to see. And another thing that was eye-opening in that experience was, I mean, again, I wasn't going there expecting that this would happen to me. Other activists that were on the trip said I wasn't surprised that it happened. I was not expecting it at all, especially because a few days before I was in a liberated village where nothing happened. But another very frustrating and eye-opening thing was that the airplane came and then dropped the TNT barrel, and then it went away. And then he comes back. And the first time I didn't hear what an airplane sounded like. But then I sit down, and I'm awake at this point, and the activist says, listen, listen, that's the sound of a Sahoy. That's it. And I'm like, what do you mean? I can't hear it. He's like, listen, it rings in both of your ears. So I'm sitting there trying to listen to what a Sahoy sounds like. I'm trying to catch the ringing in both of my ears. And I'm standing there, and I look at the activists, and what can we do, what can we do? And I'm asking these questions that obviously have no responses. And there's no answer to what we can do, because there's nowhere you can hide. We were about 8 people, nowhere you can hide, nowhere you can run. The airplane dips in 3 seconds, drops something, and leaves. And the lack of control in that situation is something that I cannot explain, because we're American, you know, we're used to having control, we're used to having routine, we're used to knowing what's next. But in this situation, this kind of defined the lack of control. And then he leaves, okay? And then every sound after that becomes the sound of an airplane. A motorcycle that was going to find out how many people have been killed or take the wounded sounds like an airplane. A car driving by sounds like an airplane. And you have to ask, is that an airplane? Is that an airplane? They say, no, no, no. But then the airplane comes back again, and you have to recognize what the sound of the airplane sounds like. So that was something that was very frustrating and very eye-opening to see. Unfortunately, that we had to experience. But you know, there's a reason, obviously, that we experienced it. And what was also tough was the last about 10 minutes that I was there. The wife of the FSA soldier had prepared food for us, and she was expecting us to stay. We voted to leave. As a team, we voted that it was best to leave. And when I went to go say bye to her, she wouldn't look at me in the eyes. And I asked for her forgiveness. I'm sorry that I'm leaving, and she wouldn't look at me in the eyes. Of course, she's not mad at me, but this sense of abandonment is everywhere in Syria. And, you know, they tell you that the international community knows exactly what's going on. And they tell you that the international community is taking part in what's going on just because of their silence and their lack of action. But I saw that very clearly in the eyes of the wife of the FSA soldier, who wouldn't look at me when I was leaving. And I said, how do you live like this? And she says, in Arabic, she says, it's adi. And so this idea of it, so adi means normal. So everybody kept repeating this to me. I went and talked to FSA soldier, how do you live like this? It's adi, it's normal. And then you feel anger again, because this is not something that should be normal. A MiG or Sukhoi flying from hours away can be there in a few minutes, dropping a TNT barrel and leaving, is not something that should be normal. And the international community has made it so that this is normal for these people. And it's not just normal for the people that can kind of comprehend what's going on, but it's normal for the children. And so a few of the activists went outside. I was scared. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see the MiG. But a few of the activists that were with us went outside, and they would kind of look for the MiG, and they would talk to the children. And one of the conversations that happened was that the activist said, who got killed in that bombing? And he said, oh, it was one of my friends. And he's not crying. He's like, yeah, it was just one of my friends. And they continue playing on the streets. So that happened. And then I saw a mother taking down her laundry on the roof of her house at the same time. So you look around and you see that normal life is continuing, despite the most abnormal situation, despite the most abnormal circumstances, life is continuing. And I think the international community is what has normalized such an occurrence of happening. So that was kind of what happened with our trip, our bombing, and I kind of just want to take this kind of a step further. And, you know, looking back at what we saw, looking back at the kind of the evolution of the revolution and how it's kind of at a military stalemate, and, you know, you see a humanitarian crisis of utmost proportions. You see UNICEF saying that it's probably going to be one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. You see all this heartache, and you see it, and the situation on the ground is quite simply a testament to the lack of support that the Syrian people are facing. Whether, I mean, I don't want to get into obviously political discussions. It is a political situation, and obviously my stance is very clear. But whether it is supporting through humanitarian aid, through the right channels, or it is, kind of supporting the opposition. There's a lot that should have been done earlier the right ways and could be done in the future so that Syria does not become a failed state. But this lack of support is a testament to what, this is kind of just signifies what the Syrian people are facing. What's going on in Syria right now, it's at a very delicate time. I'm sure you guys are aware. What dominates, obviously, the media is this armed struggle. And what dominates is this presence of extremists and, the lack of support that the Free Syrian Army may have. Rather than, the civilian desire to live and the civilian desire to feed the families and to go back to school. And you don't hear that anymore. But the fact of the matter is that this is happening because the right groups are not supported and because these people don't have the tools to do so. They don't have the tools to meet the needs of the people. They don't have the bread. They don't have the fuel for the heating. They lack everything. And so what we see is that the well-funded elements of the Free Syrian Army, like I said, meeting the needs of the people, they're able to give bread and they're able to give food. And so they're winning the hearts and the minds of the people, even though they're not that large of a number. So we see that the flaw in supporting civilian initiatives is clear, because what we want, of course, what you want is twofold, obviously. You want to be able to kind of end this conflict, whether it be through a political solution. You want to end the conflict, but you also want to strengthen the civilians, so that not only so that they have the ability to kind of feed people, but so that they are seen as their legitimate representation. Because at the end of the day, this is a revolution. They want a government that represents them, and this is going to start at the local level. So you need the support of the humanitarian aid should be going through these councils, to feed the people, to make sure that the food is getting to the right place, to make sure that the salaries are getting to the right place, but also to build this to give a glimpse into what a future Syria can look like, and that is seen as legitimate by its people. Of course, this comes through supporting these initiatives to empower them. And when they are empowered, they are legitimate in the eyes, and that, of course, empowers them above the military arm and the military struggle that's going on. And so the military struggle, they can deal with what they have to deal with, and they can fight their battle, but the civilians can fight their own kind of daily struggle. And this can be done, of course, obviously through the opposition. What we saw most recently is that the international community has more recently pledged more aid, humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. But this aid is going through regime-sanctioned agencies. So we have about, I believe it's like $500 million of aid coming in from the UN, which is, of course, aid, and it should be accepted by the people. But it only goes to about, I think it's 2,000 groups that are doing work inside Syria, but the regime has okayed them. And not all of them are bad. Some of them, for example, you have the Syrian Arab Red Crescent that is able to get the funds. And in some places they do good work and they're able to reach opposition strongholds, but in other places the majority of the aid goes to regime-controlled areas. So what you're having is the aid coming in through the regime. The majority of it is going to regime-controlled areas, and the smaller amount of going through the opposition is going to the opposition, simply because the international community still sees the Assad regime as the legitimate representation of the Syrian people, so we have to go through him. So we're seeing that the aid goes to the wrong people, because when you're talking about aid, you're talking about, obviously food and all these things, heating. These services aren't cut off in regime-controlled areas. Of course they're effective, but they're not cut off. So these are people that are getting aid. Everybody needs aid in Syria, but they're getting aid when there are people that need it more. And then what we saw, again, with the UN pledging $500 million, is that there's an inefficiency to the distribution of the aid. So $500 million sounds like a lot of money that can do good work. But, these little ways of delivery, again, going to the wrong areas, but a small example is that there was an aid delivery that was supposed to go to Assad, which is in northern Syria, the area that we drove through. But rather than go through the Turkish border, which is about 10 minutes away, and go through a FSA-controlled border, the aid was delivered via airplane in Latakia, which is a couple of hour drives away. So imagine the cost of, having to use a plane to land the plane, and then driven through Syria. So there's security costs, the aid is going through the regime. So all of these costs piling up. So a lot of the money is used just to protect the envoy of aid, for example. And then again, it's regime sanctioned. So you're seeing regime kind of agencies coming to deliver aid to opposition. So what we see with both the humanitarian aid and the standstill militarily is that, and the military situation in Syria, is that it's at a stalemate. And so when you talk to the Syrians on the ground, when they heard about this, I mean, from what I heard, the aid in the northern area was refused by a lot of the people there, because what they say is, so you want to feed me long enough for me to wait until I get hit by an Assad airstrike. And now the suburbs of Aleppo is, like I said, is raining scuds apparently. So of course, so there's the idea of aid being distributed and the inefficiency of it. And then that there's the example of the most recent aid delivery. And so kind of just to sum it all up, I think it's safe to say that the Assad regime is going to fall. And I think it's safe to say, I mean, the question of course is when, how bad, who will be in power next, how can we ensure that it's how can we aim for a stable country, how can we aim to make sure that the chaos doesn't pour into the rest of the fragile region. And the tools are there because the civilians are there and the initiatives are there. But the longer that this goes on, the higher probability for chaos post-Assad, the higher probability for sectarian tensions, and the higher probability for rebuilding Syria. That'll take longer, of course. But like I said, the solutions are on the ground in the people. The solutions to get to the people are there, but it's about refunneling the aid and the support to the right people so that they're able to start this transition now and move forward. So I think that's kind of what I have to say, and I think I'm good on time.